Okay, Dylan, today we're going to talk about something that is getting a lot of press, it's getting a lot of attention in the political world. It's something that's very rarely spoken about in the investment world, but it's actually something that's more important than people think. So I thought that this would be a great opportunity, given the political importance of this issue, to talk about the impact of illegal immigration on the US economy, first of all, and then to get into how illegal immigration actually impacts the markets and what Trump's proposed policies of really clamping down or restricting the flow of immigration, what those policies, what effects those policies would actually have on the stock market if they were actually implemented. So, in our conversation today, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that when we're talking about illegal immigration, when we're talking about the impacts of it, it's very important to differentiate the impacts of illegal immigration on different areas. And so, when people have a conversation about illegal immigration, they're usually lumping everything all together. But it's one thing to talk about the impact of illegal immigration, for example, on certain economic statistics. It's another thing to talk about the impact of illegal immigration if we're talking about the long-term well-being of US citizens. And it's another thing to talk about the impact of illegal immigration on the stock market. These are actually three different topics, although there's points of intersection between all three of them. So in the course of our conversation today, I really want to help our listeners sort of differentiate the impacts on these three areas so we can have a more informed view and a more informed discussion about the impacts of illegal immigration on American life and specifically on the economy, on the market.
Okay, well, great. Why don't we go ahead and start talking about the impact of illegal immigration on the statistics, on the immediate economic impact?
Yeah, that's a good place to start because if we're just looking at the impact of legal immigration on the statistics that we as investors and maybe even as American citizens who might follow the day to day of economic statistics, the impact of illegal immigration on these statistics is actually quite positive. So, as an example, the single most important data point that we as investors follow month to month is the employment data, non-farm payrolls, and the unemployment rate. And it's very clear that during the Biden administration, during the last 4 years, illegal immigration has had a very positive impact on the payrolls numbers. In other words, payrolls growth has been a lot stronger than anybody would have expected 4 years earlier. The rate of payroll employment, which was probably expected to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 68 to 80,000 at full employment, has actually been above 200,000. And that's basically because of the surge of illegal immigration has really increased the rate of payroll growth. And it's also had positive effects on other pieces of economic data that we see on a day-to-day basis. So for example, retail sales. Illegal immigrants buy a lot of stuff at stores. And so sales growth is running stronger than people would have expected a few years ago. GDP growth is also growing a lot faster than you would expect the economy to grow when the economy is at full employment. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the labor force is growing a lot faster than could have been expected given the organic rate of population growth, the organic rate of native-born workers coming into the workforce, and the previous trends in terms of, because we've always had illegal and legal immigration. So there's always been a certain amount of growth in the labor force from that. But the thing is that we've just had this really outsized growth in the immigrant labor force coming from illegal immigration in the last 4 years. And so that's really juiced the GDP numbers. So we as investors are sitting here and we're listening to a lot of really positive economic data that's come out in the last 4 years. And strictly speaking, statistically speaking, it has been positive in those regards. But by the same token, there are a few negatives that are, or at least potential negatives, that aren't accounted for in this type of data.
And what type of negatives would those be?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of negatives. First of all, there's the issue. One of the issues that's most spoken about is the issue of the fiscal impact of immigration. Now, there's been a lot of different studies about this, and there's a lot of disagreements. But the reality is that most studies have concluded that when you take into account both federal, state, and local government spending and the intake, because illegal immigrants do pay a certain amount of taxes, primarily through payroll. But when you look at the services that they consume in terms of various types of government assistance, welfare services, and certainly and even more so if you take into account education services for the kids that they have here, then illegal immigration is a net negative from a fiscal point of view. In other words, there's more spending as a result of illegal immigration than there is taxation coming in. So that's actually been something that's been expanding the fiscal deficit. It's also therefore something that's been expanding the national debt. But what's interesting about that is that although we normally think about fiscal deficits being a bad thing and expanding national debt as being a bad thing, in the short term, this is actually a boost to the economy because the government is actually spending money, giving certain types of welfare benefits, housing benefits, and so forth. That's being spent on illegal immigrants, and that's helping to juice the economy. So again, this is another area where we can see that illegal immigration is actually boosting the economy through the fiscal expenditures, but this is actually creating some longer term problems potentially as the country has a larger fiscal deficit and has larger debt. Now, there's a whole bunch of other issues that really are very difficult to quantify that are not really part of the statistics that we follow on a day-to-day basis, where the impact of illegal immigration is either very unclear or it's actually negative. So, as an example, the primary area where illegal immigration can be very problematic is in the area of wages. When you have a very large influx of illegal immigration, particularly of, let's say, labor that's at the lower end of the pay scale. And one of the things that's interesting to understand about illegal immigration is that roughly 69% of illegal immigrants have not completed high school. So when they come into the United States, they're essentially going to be competing for jobs or entering the job market in competition with native-born Americans that might just have a high school education or might actually be high school dropouts. And so the wages of this particular segment of the population are being held back. And we see this in the statistics. Wages for people at the lower end of the wage scale have been stagnant or even losing ground in real terms during the last many years in the United States relative to wages in higher earning jobs and professions that have actually been growing, at a pretty decent pace, but where you don't have very much impact of illegal immigration. So this is something that's actually having a negative distributional effect, or it's having negative effect on the distribution of income. So one of the things that we have to see is that when we're talking about the impact of illegal immigration on the economy, one of the things we have to ask is on whose economy? If you're talking about the economy of upper middle class people, they're not suffering from the competition of illegal immigration. But people at the lower end of the wage scale, they are being impacted by this. One of the consequences of this, and again, this is very difficult to measure, is on labor force participation. Because in this country, we have a social safety net, right? When people earn below a certain threshold of income, the government comes in and provides assistance in terms of housing, in terms of food through food stamps, in terms of direct welfare payments, healthcare. There's a whole social safety net in this country, which is, depending on the state that you're living in, can be more or less important. And one of the problems that we see in this country is that for a lot of people, it doesn't actually make sense for them to get out of unemployment or to actually come into the labor force, because the wages that they would be earning, the marginal benefit that they get from it is pretty much nothing. In some cases, they'd be worse off. A lot of people decide that they don't actually want to work because they actually are better off receiving government benefits. Overall, they actually have a better quality of life than they would have if they took a low-paying job. And this is where the impact of illegal immigration is actually the most severe, right? Because illegal immigration is precisely impacting the wages of people at that lower end of the income scale. There's countries in the world for example, such as in Switzerland, that have very restrictive immigration laws, where people at the lowest end of the income scale actually earn pretty substantial amounts of income, what we would consider to be middle class type of income here in the United States. People who are nail artists or who work in manual labor type of jobs are actually get very high salaries there because they don't have competition of immigration at that lower end of the scale. So the wages of people at the lowest part of the income ladder are actually relatively high. And they're so high that for those workers, it doesn't make sense to earn welfare. They actually prefer to work rather than to live off of government benefits. But in the United States, because of the fact that wages are being held down by illegal immigration, a lot of Americans end up choosing not to work. And we see this in the statistics where there's been an alarming trend in the last few years for a higher and higher percentage of the prime age working population to basically be out of the labor force. This is especially evident in the case of prime age males in the United States, where the percentage of prime age males that are not in the labor force has pretty much skyrocketed. It used to be something like only about 2-3% of prime age males were out of the labor force. Now this has actually risen to something like 11% of the entire prime age male population is no longer even in the workforce anymore. Now, within that group of prime age males that are not even in the workforce, it's even more alarming if you look at it by age. Something like 15% of millennials are out of the labor force, whereas something like 7% of baby boomers are out of the labor force. There's also some generational impacts here that are being observed, but this is pretty alarming because if we look at the future of this country, if the young folks in this country aren't getting skills and aren't working and aren't integrating into society, this spells for a very difficult future for America. So a lot of people think that in order to pull people back into the labor force, we have to allow wages to actually increase at the lower end, so people don't make this choice of preferring to live off of government benefits. But that's a whole other issue, because the truth of the matter is that if we allow wages to rise at the lower end, then there's going to be some people that are going to be upset about that, and we'll talk about that a little later.
Yeah, so I think it is important to kind of discuss here that we're talking about two contradicting ideas. One is that there's a lot of kind of immediate benefits to illegal immigrants coming in. And I think we can kind of go more in depth into that, some of those positive impacts on the economy versus sort of these more hidden, more difficult to see, maybe not as obvious ideas that can have long-term repercussions. And one of the things that we actually had discussed in the past was, and you made a really good point, which is, not only are these illegal immigrants coming in and increasing non-farm payroll numbers, increasing retail sales numbers, and a variety of other statistics, they're buying stuff, but they're also coming here with nothing essentially. And also there's the fiscal element as well, as you mentioned. But once they come here with nothing, that means they're required to purchase stuff, particularly, these durable goods, cars, TVs, appliances for their homes. So this is also having a kind of a boon for the economy, and in a very particular cyclical sector of the economy, the durable goods. And also kind of similar to that would also be the impact on housing, the housing market growth. So I think that's pretty interesting to get into, because these are, not only is it just simply the employment numbers looking good and the retail sales number looking good, but the kind of markers of a true healthy economy are actually being boosted. So it's kind of hard to differentiate between these sort of long-term hidden repercussions and the fact that it actually kind of makes the economy look super healthy.
Absolutely. I mean, and you just pointed out that this actually boosts investment, because housing is a big part of investment, right? Residential investment is a very large part of overall investment. Every immigrant that comes in the country, the infrastructure has to be enlarged, right? Whether it be water, electricity, any type roads, any type of infrastructure has to accommodate this new population. So there's going to be spending on that. And that type of spending, interestingly, even though it had designed to have a long-term impact, it has an outsized short-term impact. Because, for example, when you build a road, whatever's spent on building the road is accounted for in GDP this year, even though that road might be around for 20 years. So it really juices up the GDP numbers in the short term as a result of this type of influx. And you just mentioned certain types of products. The first types of products that immigrants are essentially forced to buy when they get here, because they don't come with anything, right? They can't carry very much with them. They have to buy in the United States, because we don't have a lot of great public transportation. They end up having to buy cars to transport themselves. They buy televisions for themselves. They have to buy household appliances. These are sort of big ticket items, which again, the purchase of these big ticket items has a bigger impact on the economy than if they were just buying at the rate that a native born American is buying. In other words, let me put it a different way. If you have two people, a native born American and an illegal immigrant, that have the exact same job at the exact same wage, and they're working for the same company, the purchases of the illegal immigrant are going to have a bigger boost to the U.S. economy than the native worker, because they're simply going to be buying bigger ticket items and a different type of item that kind of juices the economy in a different way. These are benefits that are reflected in government statistics immediately. But what are some of the other things that aren't really reflected? Well, some people say that in cities where you have a big influx of illegal immigration, there's going to be issues with crime, with more crime. There's an issue of what happens in the public schools. When you have an influx of illegal immigration that comes into the public school system, and especially a lot of kids that don't know English and that may actually come from backgrounds where their parents don't have a lot of education, that's going to create problems with the standards in the public schools. And what we've seen is that there's been a lowering of standards in the public schools in order to kind of accommodate the skills of these illegal immigrants. And so that's actually hurting the native born population, and it's bringing overall educational standards in the United States down. That's not to say that illegal immigration is the only reason why educational standards are coming down, but it's a contributing factor. But it's not something that shows up in the GDP numbers, certainly not in the short term, right? But these are very real issues. Any parent who has a kid who goes to a public school and has seen that there's a lot of illegal immigrants going into that school, they see that there's actually real problems there, but that's not reflected in the GDP numbers. Another really big issue is the cost of housing. In the United States, we know that housing costs have risen dramatically. The price of homes, if you want to buy a home, has risen tremendously, and rental costs have been rising tremendously. And there's no doubt that the influx of illegal immigration, especially in the last 4 years, has been putting upward pressure on rental prices in particular, which ends up translating also into purchase prices of homes. Now, again, this has a distributional effect, because most illegal immigrants are not buying high-end properties. They're going to be putting pressure on the lower end of the market. So one of the things that you actually see in the United States, which is very unfortunate, but it's very real, is that the gap between what, for example, young Americans are paying that are at the lower end of the income scale, what they pay for rent, versus their peers that might have really high-end jobs. Let's say young investment banker. That investment banker might be making 6 times the wage of a lower-end worker, but he's not paying, or he or she is not paying 6 times the rent. You follow me?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I've seen this in my own life, searching for apartments. It kind of puts you as a seeker of apartments in a weird position, because you're like, well, I gotta almost, you don't have to, but you're kind of put in a weird situation where you go, okay, well, I could pay this amount to live in a pretty low income area in a low income building, or just a minor increase up, and now you're gonna have to jump to like luxury, because it's not really this market that's available for lower end, middle end, and higher end. It's just the gap between the quality is so large that it almost kind of incentivizes you, if you're kind of on that cusp, to be like, well, I guess I'll go stay at the more luxurious place.
Exactly. And what that happens is that for younger workers or just in general, workers that are at lower end of the income scale, they end up having to pay a huge portion of their salary is going to go into housing, which is going to leave a lot less left over to buy other things. And therefore, the quality of life is going to suffer. If we didn't have all this pressure at the lower end of the housing market, the relative price of housing at the lower end would be a little lower, and therefore the quality of living of people at that lower end might be a little higher. So this is another example of a distributional effect. It's, we talk about housing, we talk about housing prices being pressured. That's a very general kind of concept. And in fact, for most upper middle class Americans and upper middle class Americans, that doesn't mean anything. But if you're actually young or at the lower end of the income scale, this is kind of existential. It really, really impacts the quality of your life.
Yeah, it's interesting because what it seems like is basically you're kind of putting a squeeze on the lower class because it's kind of they're getting hit at both ends. You got the housing prices going up and the wage pressures going down, so they're getting crushed. And maybe it's time to get into kind of the Trump ideas of what would happen if Trump's able to implement what his intended policies are. Because right now we're seeing a situation where the lower class is being squeezed, but the inverse of this is if there were mass deportations and a complete shutdown of the border preventing illegal immigrants inflows, now you're putting a squeeze more on the middle class.
Absolutely. That's really interesting, both economically and politically. Because one of the things that we definitely see is that as a result of labor costs being held down for the lower end of the income scale, that means that middle class and upper class Americans get to enjoy cheap labor, which actually increases their standard of living. So whether you're looking for housekeeping services like lawn services for your house, services for handyman, any type of labor services that are enjoyed by middle and upper middle income Americans, they're actually very cheap. These type of services, if you lived in a country like Switzerland, are extremely expensive, and most people aren't even able to enjoy them. So therefore, on a relative scale, a lot of middle class people in certain parts of the world where immigration is restricted are going to have lesser quality of life than you actually can here in the United States, because people in the United States actually enjoy a certain standard of living precisely because wages are being depressed at the lower end of the income scale. But what's interesting, what you just said, is that if Trump were actually to implement his policies, and that's a big if, what we're actually going to see is that the middle class will end up getting squeezed, because what's going to happen is that wages are going to rise at the lower end of the income scale. Costs will rise for the services that are provided by people at the lower end of the income scale. And so middle class folks are going to feel like their expenses are rising. And they're actually going to enjoy a lower standard of living at the same time that the poorer segments of society will actually be enjoying a higher standard of living. Now, for the richest people, it won't make much of a difference at all, because they can afford to pay more. In other words, if it costs more for lawn care, rich folks won't like it, but they're going to consume it anyway and they'll be fine. So the only ones that will actually be negatively impacted in a way that they can feel it are going to be the middle class. And it's going to be interesting to see if we have that sort of dynamic, whether middle class Americans might actually reconsider their stance regarding these policy issues, because I think that most middle class Americans aren't aware at all about the fact that they enjoy a pretty high standard of living precisely because they're able to have access to cheap labor. This even impacts housing. For example, a lot of Americans are able to afford houses, despite the fact that we have really rising housing prices in the United States. They're still a lot lower than they are in Europe and a lot of other places in the world. And this has to do with the fact that our construction workers make a lot less money than construction workers do in Europe and some other places. And so that means that the cost of housing is actually a little lower than it would be in Europe and some other places, which means that, housing is more affordable, and we have higher home ownership rates, for example, in the United States than almost in any other part of the world. But that advantage, so to speak, that the middle class enjoys today could actually disappear if we actually have rising wage rates for construction workers. So that's actually a very interesting political dynamic that will play out over the longer term if we end up getting some really restrictive policies on immigration.
Well, that brings up an interesting question because there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. On one end, we were saying earlier about how the influx of illegal immigration actually puts, at least at the lower end, puts some pressure in housing prices. But on the other end, you were saying how construction and labor costs has actually made housing affordable in the U.S.
I mean, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because this really highlights something really important about how illegal immigration has big distributional effects. So bear with me for a moment. To summarize your question, on the one hand, a large influx of illegal immigration keeps labor costs down, specifically the cost of construction workers. That's a positive in terms of the cost of housing. And I mentioned that that's actually one of the reasons why housing is actually somewhat affordable in the United States, and we have higher home ownership rates compared to other places in Europe. On the other hand, there's a contradictory effect, which is that the population growth that we get from this influx of illegal immigration puts pressure on the scarce resource, the resource that's absolutely scarce, which is land and location. And so the prices of land have risen and the value of location has risen. Now, in this equation, who benefits? Clearly, therefore, it's the owners of capital, the owners of land, and the owners of people that live in the best, or that have land in the best locations. They get a huge profit boost, right? And they get a huge wealth boost from the demographic pressure on this very scarce resource. On the other hand, we have relatively low costs in terms of the labor cost of housing, which actually keeps the cost of housing a little bit more accessible. But look at the distributional impact. The laborers, right, that are building the houses, they are getting relatively low wages, or their wages are rising a lot slower than they would be otherwise. Whereas the cost of housing is rising, and it's actually getting out of reach of the very people that are building the houses. We could talk about a lot of other products as well. In other words, and so what we see here is that the owners of capital are disproportionately benefiting. And who are the owners of capital? Generally, people at the higher end of the income scale, and the people that are getting most negatively impacted are on the lower end of the income scale. And this is something that we see throughout the economy. And there's actually a statistic that is very interesting. And this has been going on for more than 20 years. So this is not just a thing that happened during the Biden administration, which is a statistic called the labor share of income, which is the share of labor income in total income in the United States, has been declining tremendously in the last 20 some odd years. Whereas the share of national income that goes to capital, primarily profits, have been rising tremendously relative to the share from labor. And we can kind of see why in this discussion that I just had on housing, where we have this effect where, on the one hand, wages are being held down, and that's the labor share of national income. In other words, the share of GDP that benefits sort of workers, people who earn their income from their labor, their wages, their income is being sort of held back. Whereas people who actually own capital and therefore benefit from the profitability of companies, for example, people in the upper middle class that own shares, people who are entrepreneurs, people who own small businesses, people who are shareholders in large businesses, people who are capitalists, people who own land, who own real estate, they've benefited tremendously. And so this has actually contributed to these huge disparities that we see in the distribution of income, but even more so in terms of the distribution of wealth. And while it's clearly not the case that illegal immigration is responsible for all of these income disparities and wealth disparities. It is actually a pretty substantial um, contributor to these disparities.
So why don't we do a recap real quick with this the illegal immigration impact on lower income folks, because this is pretty interesting. We have a downward pressure on wages, an upward pressure on low income housing and lower income rents. We have what you just mentioned there, this kind of share of capital. It seems like a lot of things kind of going against purely kind of this distributional impact is pretty aggressively impacting one group.
Exactly. And that brings up an interesting point, which is that clearly people at the lower end of the income distribution and wealth distribution are being kind of negatively impacted. And that brings up the question, what happens if Trump's policies actually get put into place? In other words, what happens if Trump's proposal to sort of shut down the borders and really shut down the flow of illegal immigration, if he's actually able to implement this, what would happen if he actually was successful in mass deportations? And this brings up a very interesting issue, which is that what we could probably expect to happen is that the income of the lowest income Americans who work certain types of jobs would actually rise because there would be less of a supply of labor, and employers would be forced to bid up the wages in order to be able to employ workers, because they wouldn't be able to just hire cheaper foreign labor that's coming in and that's willing to work at just about any wage. And this is actually going to put a squeeze on middle income Americans. That's a very interesting political scenario. In other words, will the middle class tolerate that sort of demotion in their standard of living as a result of the fact that they're not able to afford certain services that they were before, or they just won't be as accessible to them, even if this is good for the lower class? Is what I pointed out earlier, is that the whole point of this type of policy, the biggest benefit that this policy could have, is to pull a lot of people that are currently out of the labor force and try to pull them back into the labor force and bring them back into society, so to speak. Because we all know that when people aren't in the labor force, that's a very destructive thing for them as individuals and for society. People who are out of the labor force are more likely to be depressed, to abuse drugs and alcohol, to commit crime. And all those types of indicators could really have a major improvement. And a lot of people who are simply and essentially have been kind of left behind and abandoned in our society today, some of those people could be brought back into the fold. At least that's the hope. And, do we as a society care enough about those folks? Or will the middle class sort of say, hey, you know what, we prefer to have our cheap gardening services? That's going to be a very interesting question, because nobody's actually been forced to confront that reality, right? And if Trump actually were to implement his policies and this were to hit the middle class, we'll actually have to see what the political reaction would be. That's actually a very interesting question, and I think it's sort of unknowable at this point.
And while speaking of unknowable, there does seem to be, obviously, we've talked about some of the positive impacts that it can have on the economy in terms of illegal immigration, can have some positive impacts. And deportation and, kind of shutting down that border has another set of positive impacts, as you just discussed, particularly distributional and bringing people into the labor force. So I guess the question is, has this been studied? What evidence is there? Do we know? Do we have any idea? Net benefits, which is the best option?
I mean, that's a great question, and I wish I had a great answer for you. But the reality is that, and I've looked at these studies very carefully. I've looked at dozens of studies, and they're very contradictory amongst them. There are some studies that have concluded that the net impact of large growth rates of illegal immigration is a very large net negative to the economy and to society. There's other studies that show the opposite, that large amounts of illegal immigration is actually a net positive for the economy and for society. Clearly, a lot of this has to do with the political biases that these scholars and various think tanks already have before they perform these studies, and it influences the methodologies they employ. But one of the conclusions that I've reached is that this is actually a big area that really shows the limits of our knowledge in terms of economics. Economics as a science is not truly able to determine, at least empirically, what the actual net benefits of one or the other are, at least not in a very clear fashion. So I think that the broad answer to your question is that I don't know, and I don't think that economists actually know. In the end, if we look at just total utility, to use almost a philosophical phrase, whether total utility would rise or fall as a result of large amounts of illegal immigration. But one place where I think that we do have enough knowledge to be able to determine this, because the vast majority of the studies, even the ones that conclude that there's a net benefit to legal immigration, almost all of them recognize that almost all of the negative impacts and burdens that are being caused in the United States as a result of illegal immigration are being borne by the lower classes. And that illegal immigration is probably a net negative for those people that are at the lower end of the income spectrum. So even though it's the overall impact, if we take into account, for example, the net decline in standards of living for the lower class, but the increase in standard of living of the upper middle and upper class, it's hard to tell. It could go one way or another. But I think what's almost undisputable at this point is that there is a negative impact on the lower end of the income scale and at the lower end of the wealth scale.
So we've just gone over the economic impact, kind of the immediate impact, and some of these maybe not so easy to quantify impact. The next thing we should probably look into is, what does this mean for investors, stock market? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that this is extremely underrated. The impact of large waves of illegal immigration on the stock market are a lot greater than people think. Let's just use our common sense here. You're a company, median company, average company, S&P 500. What are the impacts for S&P 500 companies of illegal immigration? In the first place, you have a boost in sales. Illegal immigrants, when they come into the United States, they buy a lot of stuff. And as I mentioned to you before, in particular, they buy a lot of the type of stuff that S&P 500 companies produce. So whether it be cars, materials that are used in housing and other infrastructure, they buy phone plans, they buy cell phones, they buy cable television. Like, essentially, you don't think of illegal immigrants as consuming a lot of technology, but in effect that they do, right? Because they're consuming social media, they're through their phones, which everybody owns. They watch television. They use technology products. And today in modern living, there are high-tech components in appliances that are purchased. And so this is also, all this stuff is helping the profitability of S&P 500 companies, and even companies that you wouldn't imagine, such as the high-tech companies that produce computer chips and produce software, because all that stuff goes into the products that illegal immigrants are consuming either directly or indirectly. So on the one hand, illegal immigration juices sales, but on the other hand, it keeps wages down, right? Wage growth, as I mentioned in the previous section, has been very low relative to profits and relative to revenues. And so when you have revenues rising because of high sales and you have profits being held down, what that means is you have wider profit margins. Today, in the United States stock market, in the US stock market, profit margins are at an all-time high relative to history. There's never been a time in the history of the US stock market when profit margins have been this high and where returns on capital have been this high. And so one of the reasons for this is precisely because the labor share of income has fallen. It goes back to what we talked about before, is that companies are able to pay relatively less for labor, and the returns on capital are actually very high. That translates into high levels of profitability. So this has two effects. One is that profit growth is high, and we know that stocks rise in part as a function of profit growth. So with profit growth being high, stock prices go up. But the second thing is that it boosts the multiple, the PE multiple, because higher profitability means that the fair value PE ratio is higher relative to when profitability is lower. I'm talking about profit growth here. I'm talking about profitability, returns on capital, returns on invested capital, return on equity. When return on equity or return on invested capital are higher, that means that stocks deserve a higher PE multiple. And so that's another thing that we see here, is that currently stocks in the United States are trading at the highest multiples that they have at virtually any other time in history. Now, clearly, illegal immigration isn't the only reason for high PE multiples, and it's not the only reason for high profit margins, and it's not the only reason for high revenue growth and high profit growth. But it is actually a pretty substantial contributing factor to this. And so we have to ask ourselves, what would happen if Trump was successful in implementing his policies, and all of a sudden we saw wages rising relative to profits or relative to revenues? We have revenue growth falling, because if we don't have this influx of illegal immigrants, sales growth, revenue growth is going to come down. At the same time, labor costs are going to rise. What's going to happen? Profit margins will get squeezed. So on the one hand, we'll have lower profit growth, but then also we'll have lower returns on equity and lower returns on capital. And what does that mean? That PE ratios would shrink. And so it would be a double whammy. Now, that brings up the whole question. I mean, is Trump actually going to be successful in restraining the growth of immigration? That's a whole different question. But if we assumed that he were successful, I think that what we can expect is that profit growth will decline somewhat, and also the multiples that U.S. companies trade at would actually contract somewhat.
So we're talking here about really high level stuff here, really big picture stuff. Well, why don't we try to dig a little deeper? What sectors, because some sectors are going to be impacted more and less. So for example, you mentioned tech. The illegal immigrants are maybe boosting sales. However, at least myself, I don't think of the lower end of the income is not really being impacted, in other words, in the tech industry, because the tech industry is typically higher income. So their labor is going to be higher income. So I guess you mentioned chips, manufacturing, but which sectors could stand to be hurt the most by such policy?
Well, let's think about consumers and consumer durable. I mean, let me give you an example, and I'm just pulling this example right now, is let's look at a company, let's say like Google. Google makes a lot of its money from advertising, right? Illegal immigrants, they consume advertising because they're getting on their phones and they do search and they get on YouTube and so forth. And so their revenues rise as illegal immigrants consume this digital product, right? Google doesn't just have software engineers; it also employs a certain part of its workforce is also kind of, let's say, on the lower end of the income scale. And what's actually an interesting effect that I didn't discuss before has to do with productivity. There are certain productivity gains that come from illegal immigration, and these type of productivity gains could actually be most felt by companies in the tech sector and certain companies, because, for example, if you have very constrained growth in the workforce, you're going to have supply constraint as a company and as an entrepreneur. You're going to have difficulty growing if you can't hire enough people. And so also one of the things that's going to happen is that mobility of people within a company is also going to be somewhat constrained. So what happens, for example, is if you're somebody at Google and you have some good employees and you're going to grow, you might prefer to promote people from within. And so their skills that they've learned as a result of working in your company for a few years are going to be taken advantage of. And that worker is going to be promoted to another job where he or she is going to be more productive, because they can be replaced by a worker that is coming beneath them and will do the job that that person was doing previously. Now, if you didn't have that replacement, that worker that otherwise would be more productive, right, is going to actually be down here and going to stay less productive. So there is actually a situation that occurs here, which is that the population that's already been here for a certain amount of time, certainly the native-born population and the immigrant population that's been here a long time, this is going to give them a certain amount of mobility within firms. It's going to increase their productivity, and so that's going to be reflected in productivity growth and GDP growth and so forth. But it's also going to be reflected in the profitability of firms, because productivity is directly linked to profitability, or excuse me, productivity and profitability are directly linked. So pretty much a lot of companies would benefit from this, even though it's not entirely, the connection doesn't seem entirely clear. Now, the type of companies that would certainly, let's say, be impacted by this in a more direct fashion would be companies that actually employ a lot of labor that's actually illegal immigrant labor. So in the food processing business, agriculture, certain types of manufacturing jobs, certain types of industries that employ a lot of lower end service workers, these types of companies, their costs would be rising, whereas their sales might be declining. Companies that, for example, so there is going to be a differential impact, and as investors, one would need to really look into precisely these issues and kind of sort out which companies could actually benefit and which could actually be the most hurt, because there is going to be a differential impact depending on what kind of the constitution of that company's workforce, also the type of customers that they're selling stuff to, and let's say the growth rate of that customer base that they're serving. Companies who are benefiting from their customer bases expanding as a result of illegal immigration, they've been benefiting, but obviously if that illegal immigration gets dried up, then those companies will be directly impacted negatively. So a company, for example, like AT&T or Verizon or companies like that would, for example, be directly impacted, because those companies benefit the more users that they have consuming, for example, internet services, telephone services, and stuff like that. Those companies would be directly hit, for example, as a result of the fact that you're going to have lower consumption of those products or lower consumption growth. They may actually be impacted because to the extent that those companies also have a fairly high percentage of their workforce that is at the lower end of the scale, the wages would rise. So companies like that would actually do very poorly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I do want to challenge or at least question the idea of, for example, with a lot of these tech companies, Google, for instance, the advertisements, these are international revenue sources. So from the sales perspective, if an illegal immigrant is deported, still is going to have a phone, still going to be using YouTube, still going to be using various being a ad revenue source for Google.
But Google doesn't pay as much for ads in Guatemala as they do in the United States, because people earn a lot less in Guatemala than they do in the United States. So if that worker who's consuming ads in the United States is deported back to Guatemala, Google's going to be making less money.
Yeah. So clearly, this policy or intended policy of Trump has pretty profound implications. It's going to profoundly impact employment numbers. It's going to profoundly impact cultural and socioeconomic issues in this country, and can potentially profoundly impact the stock market. So I guess the question is it even possible? We've been kind of assuming that it's a possibility for the last few minutes, but is it even possible for him to go forward with this? Will he even want to go forward with this, given his ties in the real estate industry? How likely can we expect something like this to happen? And what do you actually think? Presumably, he could implement some measures, but maybe not entire mass deportation, shut down the borders. What do you think is a realistic policy that could be implemented in the next, say, year or throughout his term?
Yeah. Look, I'll be very, very surprised if Trump actually goes through with his, precisely because it would have very profoundly negative immediate impacts. Because that's the thing. If we're looking at the longer term impacts, I think there's some good arguments that could be made that a slower rate of immigration would actually help the United States as a whole, but particularly at the lower end of the income scale, which is, I think, the part of the population that a lot of Americans should be very concerned about, because this is the part of the population that's really falling behind. And but I'm a little bit pessimistic that Trump is actually going to be able to go through, or that he ultimately will go through with his proposals. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I think that it's just politically, I find it very difficult to believe that Americans are really going to support mass deportations. It's one thing to hear the term mass deportation. It's another thing to see the television images of people being dragged away, crying, sometimes leaving their kids behind that actually were born in the United States. I just don't know if the American people have the stomach for that. So, for example, all this rhetoric about mass deportations, I'm very doubtful that it's actually going to happen. The other thing that makes me very doubtful that this is going to happen is that a lot of companies clearly benefit from this mass influx of labor. And once they see their labor costs rising, they're going to be crying and going to Trump. And a lot of these entrepreneurs and business people have Trump's ear. They're going to be saying, hey, we need these workers for our companies to be able to work. So if they're in the food processing industry, which is an industry that I mentioned to you before, in the construction industry, they're going to be crying. And because these are items, food, for example, and construction, that precisely go into the CPI and that kind of impact consumer prices, and they impact the middle class, as I mentioned to you before, I think it's going to be very hard for Trump to actually, go through with policies that shut down the border. One of the main policies that are actually driving illegal immigration is the very lenient policies towards so-called asylum seekers, people that are seeking political asylum. All this is a fraud. I mean, the vast majority of people that claim political asylum, this is just a fraudulent claim. They're not actually political asylees, but they've been advised in advance to do this. And so once they've been in the country for a certain number of days, they're actually given a work permit to actually work in the United States until their case is settled, which could be years into the future because of the backlogs. There's an entire industry in the United States right now that is devoted to collecting these seekers of political asylum and distributing them to companies that hire these folks. It's a whole sort of industry that's been set up of kind of, if you want to call them headhunters or placement agencies that specialize in getting asylum seekers and placing them in the right type of companies. There's a lot of vested interests that have been established. There is entire industries that have been built on this wave of illegal immigration. The companies that build the facilities that house the illegal immigrants. A lot of these are very big businesses that make big political contributions, precisely because since a lot of these businesses actually depend on public funds, they've been politically involved from day one. So when you look at how these things work, There's a lot of interest groups that are highly motivated to keep the rate of illegal immigration high. Whether we're talking about big businesses or certain types of businesses in the United States, they'll be highly organized and highly motivated. There's also a political element, right? The folks in the United States that would prefer the ethnic composition, for example, of the country to change, or for example, a lot of people in the Democratic Party believe that the Democratic Party will benefit in the long term from a higher composition of immigrants from certain places because they've seen in the past that this has actually benefited from them. So there's a lot of interest groups that are powerfully advocating in favor of high rates of illegal immigration. On the other hand, the negative impacts of illegal immigration are longer term and they're more diffuse. And so people aren't that highly motivated. They're less likely to get organized, politically organized, in order to stop the flow of illegal immigration. So political theory sort of points in the direction that despite the fact that Trump talks a really big game in terms of halting illegal immigration, that he probably won't go through with it in the end. We'll just have to see.
So we've talked a lot about the economy, the impact on the economy, the impact on the markets, and the sheer complexity of this issue is, I mean, it's definitely not understood by most people. It's not being discussed in the news. So I think it would be a good idea for you to kind of just do a summary, just discuss everything you've talked about and kind of a concluding statement.
Okay. I think that let's talk about the economy first before going into the market. In terms of the economy, I think the most important thing that we discussed today is that a lot of the benefits of illegal immigration are quantifiable and they're fairly immediate. And that and another aspect of it is that they generate interest groups that have a lot of political clout and power. Whereas some of the disadvantages of high rates of illegal immigration are longer term, they're harder to quantify, and at the same time, they don't generate as much passion and they don't generate as much organization of interest groups that would oppose illegal immigration. So from an economic and a political view, I think that it's very important to really understand these distinctions between stuff that's quantifiable and stuff that's short term versus stuff that's not quantifiable and that's longer term. And to understand the political implications of all this, which really suggests that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible politically, to actually implement serious immigration reform that would actually severely limit the influx of illegal immigration. In terms of the effects on the stock market, it really depends on that. If Trump were actually able to or wanted to implement the policies that he's proposed, then I think it would actually have a pretty significantly negative impact on the stock market over time. This is not something that's going to cause the stock market, by the way, to crash next week or even in a year. This sort of upward pressure on wages is something that would manifest itself over time. The decline in sales growth is something that's going to be sort of on the margin. And so the impact on profitability and the impact on returns on capital will be gradual over time. And most likely what that will result in is simply lower stock market returns, but over a fairly long period of time. So what investors are likely to experience as a result of something like this is not a crash, but simply that their portfolios will not be rising as quickly as they have been in the last 4 years or even in the last 10 years. And they could actually see some level of decline in the portfolios, but not a crash. But this in itself is something that's pretty significant from the point of view of an investor who's coming into the market today with valuations at pretty much all-time highs. And we have to understand is that valuations are at all-time highs partly because profit margins are also at all-time highs, and profit margins are at all-time highs in part due to favorable immigration laws, or immigration laws that are extremely favorable to U.S. companies, particularly companies that are going to be traded in the S&P 500. And so I actually think that this issue of immigration, which is something that people tend to be very passionate about politically, actually has a bigger impact on the stock market than most people believe or understand. And that's why I think it was worthwhile for us to discuss this today.